Have you ever wondered what drives someone to become a legend? Sometimes it takes just one knock at the door to change everything. This is the story of how a little girl's desperate faith transformed a mountain hermit into something far greater than he ever imagined. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity and show you that heroes aren't born. They're awakened by those who need them most. But before we begin this incredible journey, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us why kindness matters more than we ever realized. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the morning mist clung to ancient pines like whispered prayers, Marcus Thornfield had built his sanctuary far from the world that had wounded him. For 15 years, he'd lived in complete solitude, his cabin hidden so deep in the wilderness that even the bravest hunters spoke of him only in hushed tones around campfires. They called him the mountain ghost, the wild man, the hermit of Eagle's Peak. But to the desperate souls in the valley below, he was something else entirely. He was the man who appeared when all hope was lost, who pulled drowning children from rushing rivers and carried lost travelers through blizzards to safety. Marcus never sought recognition for these acts. He simply vanished back into his mountain fortress, leaving behind only grateful tears and whispered stories. But on this particular dawn, as golden light painted the peaks in shades of amber and rose, something was about to change forever. The knock came so softly that Marcus almost dismissed it as a woodpecker testing the cabin's logs. But there it was again. 3 gentle taps, barely audible above the mountain wind that sang through the towering evergreens. Marcus froze at his kitchen table, coffee cup halfway to his lips, because in 15 years of isolation, no one had ever found his hidden refuge. The nearest trail was miles away, and the path to his cabin was so treacherous that even experienced climbers avoided it during daylight hours. Yet someone was standing on his porch, knocking with the patience of someone who had traveled impossibly far to reach this moment. Marcus set down his cup with trembling hands, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. He approached the heavy wooden door slowly, each footstep echoing in the silence like thunder, wondering if this was the day his carefully constructed solitude would finally crumble. Through the small window beside his door, Marcus glimpsed something that made his breath catch in his throat. A tiny figure, bundled in a coat far too large, standing with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned patience through suffering. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled auburn hair that caught the morning light like spun copper, and eyes that held depths no child should possess. She stood perfectly still, not fidgeting or calling out, just waiting with the kind of faith that comes from having nowhere else to turn. Marcus noticed her worn shoes, patched with careful stitches that spoke of someone who had loved her enough to try, and the small bundle clutched against her chest like a treasure. But it was her posture that broke something inside him, the way she held herself with such careful hope, as if she'd been taught that good things might come to those who waited quietly enough. Marcus realized he was looking at someone who had walked through darkness to find his light. With hands that shook more than they had in years, Marcus slowly opened the door, and the mountain morning rushed in around them both like a blessing. The little girl looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, despite the exhaustion that painted shadows beneath her eyes. "Are you the mountain man they talk about in town?" she asked, her words carrying the weight of a journey that had tested every ounce of her courage. "The one who saves people when nobody else can?" Marcus found himself nodding before he could stop himself, mesmerized by the quiet strength radiating from this tiny visitor who had somehow found her way to his impossible refuge. The girl smiled then, an expression so pure and hopeful that it seemed to illuminate the entire mountainside, and Marcus knew that whatever had brought her here was about to change both their lives forever. "I'm Emma," she said simply, "and I really need your help." Emma's story unfolded like a map of heartbreak, each word carefully chosen as if she'd rehearsed this moment during the long climb up the mountain. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 months ago, she explained with the matter-of-fact tone children use when discussing tragedies too large for their understanding. The state had placed her with her aunt and uncle in the valley town of Cedar Falls, people who had taken her in out of obligation rather than love. Marcus listened in stunned silence as Emma described nights spent hungry because her guardians forgot to buy groceries, days locked outside while they entertained friends who didn't want children around. But it was the bruises she didn't mention, the way she unconsciously favored her left arm, that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. Emma spoke of running away, not with anger, but with the calm determination of someone who had weighed all options and chosen the only path that led to hope. "I heard Mrs. Patterson at the general store talking about you," Emma continued, settling cross-legged on Marcus's porch as if she belonged there. "She said you once carried her grandson 5 miles through a snowstorm when he broke his leg hunting, and that you asked for nothing in return except that she never tell anyone your real name." Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble as Emma spoke, her words painting him as some kind of folk hero when he'd only ever seen himself as a broken man hiding from his failures. She told him about other stories she'd collected, how he'd pulled the Miller family from their burning farmhouse, how he'd found little Tommy Chen when he'd been lost in the woods for 3 days. "Everyone says you only help people who really, truly need it," Emma said, her voice growing smaller but more determined, "and I really, truly need someone to want me." The simplicity of her request hit Marcus like a physical blow because in all his years of rescuing people from external dangers, he'd never encountered someone who needed saving from the absence of love itself. Emma wasn't asking for money or temporary shelter or even protection from immediate harm. She was asking for something far more precious and terrifying. She was asking for a home, for someone to choose her, for the kind of belonging that couldn't be legislated or assigned by social workers. Marcus studied her face, seeing not just the surface exhaustion and worry, but the deeper weariness of a child who had learned that adults could disappear without warning. He recognized something of himself in her careful composure, the way she held her emotions in check, as if showing too much need might drive away her last hope. Emma was asking him to become the person the mountain legends claimed he already was. "I brought this," Emma said, carefully unwrapping the bundle she'd been clutching to reveal a small wooden horse, hand-carved with loving detail. "My daddy made it for me before he died, and it's the only thing I have left that proves someone loved me once." She held it out to Marcus with both hands, offering her most precious possession as if it were payment for services rendered. "I know you probably don't want a kid around, but I promise I won't be any trouble. I can cook a little, and I'm really good at being quiet, and I won't ask for much." "No." Marcus stared at the wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of being held by small, desperate fingers, and felt something crack open inside his chest. This child had climbed an impossible mountain, carrying nothing but hope and a carved reminder of love, and she was offering both to a stranger because she had nowhere else to turn. Marcus realized that Emma hadn't come here looking for the mountain man of legend. She'd come looking for someone who might love her enough to let her stay. Marcus invited Emma inside with the awkward gentleness of a man who had forgotten how to be around other people, especially children who looked at him like he might hold the keys to their salvation. His cabin, built for solitary contemplation, suddenly felt both too small and too large. Too small for the magnitude of what Emma was asking, too large for the intimacy her presence demanded. She moved through his space with careful reverence, touching nothing without permission, her eyes wide as she took in the hand-carved furniture, the stone fireplace, the walls lined with books that spoke of a man who had once lived in the world below. Marcus found himself seeing his refuge through her eyes, not as a hiding place, but as a sanctuary that could shelter more than just his own wounded soul. But even as part of him yearned to say yes to her unspoken plea, another part recoiled in terror at the thought of being responsible for someone so precious and fragile. "I don't know anything about raising children," Marcus said finally, the words tumbling out like a confession he'd never meant to make. Emma looked up from where she'd been studying his collection of carved wooden animals, a hobby that had helped fill the endless mountain evenings, and her expression was so understanding, it nearly broke his heart. "I came up here because I couldn't handle being around people anymore," he continued, needing her to understand the magnitude of what she was asking. "I'm not good with emotions or schedules or any of the things kids need." But even as he spoke, Marcus found himself remembering the stories Emma had shared about his rescues, wondering if the man who could carry strangers to safety might also be capable of carrying one small girl toward a better future. Emma listened to his doubts without arguing, her patience suggesting she'd heard similar rejections before and had learned not to fight them. "My daddy used to say that the best people are the ones who worry about whether they're good enough," Emma said quietly, her fingers tracing the carved mane of one of Marcus's wooden horses. "He said people who think they know everything about taking care of others usually don't know anything at all." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, and Marcus realized she was offering him absolution for fears he hadn't even known he carried. She told him about her father, who had been a carpenter like Marcus, who had taught her that love wasn't about being perfect, but about showing up every day and trying your best. "I don't need you to know everything," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to gather in her storm-cloud eyes. "I just need you to want to try." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this child wasn't asking him to become someone he wasn't. She was asking him to become who he'd always had the potential to be. The afternoon stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, filled with the weight of a decision that would change both their lives irrevocably. Marcus made Emma lunch with hands that shook slightly, watching as she ate with the careful gratitude of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. She helped him wash dishes without being asked, standing on a wooden stool to reach the sink, and Marcus found himself marveling at how naturally she fit into the rhythm of his solitary life. But it was when Emma curled up in his reading chair with one of his books, her small form dwarfed by the massive leather cushions, that Marcus truly understood what he was being offered. This wasn't just about giving a homeless child shelter. This was about allowing love back into a life he'd convinced himself was better lived alone. Emma had climbed his mountain, not just seeking rescue, but offering it, showing him that salvation sometimes came in the form of someone who needed you to be brave enough to need them back. As evening painted the mountain peaks in shades of purple and gold, Marcus found himself making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Emma had fallen asleep in his chair, the wooden horse clutched against her chest, and watching her peaceful face, Marcus realized he'd already made his choice the moment she'd knocked on his door. He gently carried her to his bed, covering her with quilts his grandmother had made decades ago, and as he tucked the blankets around her small form, he whispered the words that would change everything. "You can stay, little one. You can stay as long as you want." Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, a smile crossing her face as if she'd heard his promise in her dreams. Marcus spent that night in his chair, watching over her sleep and marveling at how quickly his cabin had transformed from a refuge into a home. The silence that had once been his comfort now felt full of possibility, pregnant with the sounds of laughter and conversation that would soon fill these rooms. The next morning brought a transformation that seemed to illuminate the entire mountainside with new purpose and joy. Emma woke with the sunrise, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that comes from sleeping safely for the first time in months. Marcus taught her how to make coffee the way he liked it, and she showed him how her father had taught her to scramble eggs with just a touch of cheese. They worked together in comfortable synchronization, as if they'd been sharing morning routines for years rather than hours. Emma chatted about everything and nothing, the way the light looked different at this altitude, how the birds seemed friendlier here, her plans to help Marcus with his wood carving. Marcus found himself laughing for the first time in years, a sound so rusty and unused that it startled them both. But Emma just grinned and declared that his laugh sounded exactly like what she'd hoped a mountain man's laugh would sound like. Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that caring for Emma didn't diminish his strength. It multiplied it in ways he'd never imagined possible. She helped him tend his small garden, her tiny hands gentle with the seedlings, and he taught her to identify the calls of different mountain birds. Emma proved to be an eager student of wilderness survival, learning to read weather patterns and track animal movements with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. But it was the quiet moments that transformed Marcus most profoundly, reading to Emma by firelight, braiding her hair before bed, watching her face light up when she mastered a new skill. He realized that in teaching her to survive in his mountain world, she was teaching him to live in hers, a world where love was expressed through daily acts of care and protection. Marcus began to understand that Emma hadn't just found refuge on his mountain, she'd found her calling as his partner in the work of saving others. When word reached them that a hiker was lost in the lower valleys, Emma insisted on helping with the search, her small size allowing her to check spaces Marcus couldn't reach. She had an intuitive understanding of fear and desperation that made her invaluable in calming rescued victims, her presence a reminder that survival was possible even for the smallest and most vulnerable. Together, they became something neither had been alone, a family forged not by blood but by choice, united in their mission to be the light that others could follow home. Marcus realized that Emma hadn't just knocked on his door seeking salvation, she'd brought it with her, wrapped in the form of a love so pure it could transform even the most wounded hermit into a father. The mountain man of legend had finally become real, not through his own efforts, but through the faith of a little girl who had believed in him before he believed in himself. 6 months after Emma's arrival, Marcus stood in the Cedar Falls courthouse, his hand steady as he signed the adoption papers that would make their family official in the eyes of the law. Emma sat beside him in her best dress, one they'd bought together in town, her first new clothing in over a year, and her smile was so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire sterile government building. The social worker, who had initially been skeptical of placing a child with a mountain hermit, now watched them with tears in her eyes, seeing clearly the transformation that love had wrought in both their lives. Marcus had submitted to background checks, home inspections, and countless interviews, each one revealing not the wild man of local legend, but a gentle soul who had found his purpose in protecting one precious child. Emma had bloomed under his care, her confidence growing daily as she learned what it meant to be unconditionally wanted and cherished. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had watched this unlikely family form with a mixture of amazement and deep respect, seeing how Marcus had emerged from his mountain isolation not as a broken hermit, but as a devoted father. He now made regular trips to town for Emma's schooling and supplies, his presence no longer mysterious but warmly welcomed by neighbors who had come to understand that legends were sometimes just love stories waiting to be told. Emma thrived in her new school, her experiences on the mountain having given her a confidence and wisdom that impressed both teachers and classmates. She spoke proudly of her father, the man who had taught her to read the language of wind and weather, who could carve animals so lifelike they seemed ready to leap from his hands. Marcus attended every school event, his fierce pride in Emma's accomplishments evident to everyone who saw them together. Their mountain home had evolved into something that perfectly balanced solitude with connection, a sanctuary that welcomed both quiet contemplation and joyful noise. Emma had her own room now, decorated with Marcus's carvings and her own artwork. But she still preferred to fall asleep to the sound of his voice, reading adventure stories by the fireplace. They had established routines that honored both their needs. Morning hikes to check their weather station, afternoon lessons in wilderness skills, evenings spent carving wood or reading together. Marcus had taught Emma to see the mountain not as a place of exile, but as a kingdom where they were both royalty, responsible for protecting and nurturing everything within their domain. She had taught him that love didn't make you vulnerable. It made you invincible, because it gave you something worth fighting for. As winter approached their first full year together, Marcus and Emma stood on their porch, watching snow begin to dust the highest peaks, and he marveled at how completely his life had been transformed by one desperate knock at dawn. Emma leaned against his side, her wooden horse tucked safely in her pocket, but no longer her only treasure, and together they planned the improvements they'd make to their home before spring. They talked about building a workshop where Emma could learn advanced carving techniques, about expanding their garden to include her favorite vegetables, about the hiking trails they'd explore when the snow melted. But mostly, they simply stood in comfortable silence, two souls who had found in each other exactly what they'd been missing without even knowing it. Marcus realized that Emma hadn't just saved him from loneliness. She'd saved him from a life half-lived, showing him that the greatest adventures weren't found in solitary survival, but in the daily choice to love and be loved. The mountain man had become a father, the orphan had become a daughter, and together they had created something more powerful than any legend. They had created a home where love was the only law that mattered. And that's how a little girl's faith in mountain legends created the most beautiful family story you'll ever hear. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen not in moments of dramatic crisis, but in the quiet decision to open your heart to someone who needs you to be brave. Marcus and Emma proved that family isn't about blood. It's about choice, commitment, and the courage to love someone enough to let them change your life completely. What did you think of this incredible story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment when someone's faith in you helped you become better than you thought possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that remind us why love and kindness are the most powerful forces in the world.